So how much protein do you need for muscle growth? Let's break it down. So muscle protein synthesis is the driving force behind how our body grows and develops new muscles. This is the way that the body lays down new muscle from the protein that we eat. And interestingly, it's this constant state of flux between muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown that actually keeps the muscle on our frame relatively constant, assuming that we don't train and we're relatively sedentary. We don't all look like this. And that's for a very good reason, is because our body doesn't just take all the amino acids from our protein that we eat and put it straight back into our skeletal muscle. Essentially, there's a breakdown constantly happening throughout the day, as well as a synthesis that happens when we resistance train and when we eat protein. To put on muscle mass, we need to ensure that this balance is more skewed towards the muscle protein synthesis part of the equation, essentially so that the muscle protein synthesis outweighs the breakdown so that we get a positive net balance effect of muscle protein growth. I'm only going to focus on the nutrition part of today, but what I want you to remember as you take in this information is that muscle protein synthesis happens when we're fed with protein, and muscle protein breakdown rates are higher in fasted states. In my future videos, I'm going to talk about the biology of training in order to increase muscle protein synthesis, as well as absorption of protein itself. So please consider subscribing if you haven't already in order to hear this information in future. But now for the nutrition part and what you've all come for. So I think there is a bit of confusion around protein in the fitness industry in general, especially around timing, the so-called anabolic window, what sort of protein to take, the quality of protein, how much, when, where, etc. I want to break this down, and I wanted to look at the research and the science of how to optimize our training and our protein intake in order to gain muscle as effectively and smartly as possible. So in 2017, 11 scientists set out to establish exactly how much protein was required for people doing resistance training in order to build muscle as effectively as possible. This study was great because it was a meta-analysis, which means it compiled all the research and looked at it from a macro point of view. And it was also twice as big in terms of studies collected as the previous biggest study before it. So the way that they set this up was they only included studies that had people resistance training, and they only included studies that were greater than 6 weeks in duration. Eventually, they culled down from thousands of studies and had 49 studies that they included. And the muscle mass measurement was done through some form of scan, like DEXA, for example. And they regressed muscle gain against protein intake per day, as well as 3 other variables: protein dose, age, and training status, in order to see if muscle mass could be explained by these 3, or if it could only be explained by protein intake itself. The protein intake across all participants ranged from 0.9 grams of protein per kilogram per day up to 2.4 grams per kilogram per day. And they found that resistance training induced gains plateaued at 1.62 grams of protein per kilogram per day, or about 0.74 grams of protein per pound of body weight per day. So pretty much the threshold was 1.62 grams per kilogram of protein per day, and any more above this didn't really induce any gains in muscle mass that couldn't otherwise be achieved at the 1.62 level. However, the 95% confidence interval ranged from 1.03 grams per kilogram per day of protein to 2.2. So the scientists said in order to cover all bases and be 95% confident, it might take up to 2.2 grams per kilogram of protein per day, which is basically 1 gram per pound of body weight per day of protein. Now, they did say this is a 95% confidence interval, so it is very, very likely that this 2.2 will be too much. They only said this to cover all bases, because essentially there is a 5% chance that it may be required. The other findings were that protein supplementation was less effective as age increased, so that older participants actually needed more protein per day in order to put on muscle mass, just like the young participants. So that 2.2 grams per kilogram per day of protein may actually be more suitable for older participants as a reference range of how much protein they should be targeting per day in order to build muscle, whereas the younger participants can probably get away with 1.62 grams per kilogram per day of protein and build just as much muscle. Now, being old in this study was defined as being over 45. So really, it's very interesting in that anyone over 45 actually may require more protein in order order to reach their muscle mass goals. But the most interesting thing out of all of this was that timing of protein, eating protein post-exercise in the so-called anabolic window, and the type of protein ingested had very little, if any, effect on muscle protein synthesis. But the amount eaten per meal did matter, in that there was a threshold of about 0.25 grams of protein per kilogram per meal that was required in order to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis. This was supported in 2015 when researchers found that it actually took about 0.4 grams of protein per kilogram per meal, which is about 0.18 grams per pound of body weight of protein per meal, to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis in older participants, but it only took 0.24 grams of protein per kilogram per meal, which is 0.11 grams per pound body weight of protein per meal for the younger guys to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis. This study was very interesting because essentially it was saying that there does seem to be a threshold for muscle protein synthesis to be on or off. It's not a gradual thing that happens. Muscle protein synthesis, they're saying, essentially requires about 0.24 grams of protein per meal for the young guys and 0.4 grams of protein per meal for the older guys to actually turn it on at all, so that it's almost like a light switch, i.e. muscle protein synthesis is either on or off until that threshold is reached per meal, in which case the light switch switches on and muscle protein synthesis begins and the body starts laying down new muscle. So where does that leave us? For a 100 kilogram or 220 pound male, taking these two studies, the general recommendation would be anywhere from 162 grams of protein to 220 grams of protein if they were older per day, making sure that you get at least 40 grams of protein if you are older per meal, or per meal 24 grams of protein if you're younger. For women, the recommendations generally stay the same, except for women, your body weight generally won't be as high as a male's, in that women are generally a bit lighter than men. So the amount of protein you eat per day will probably be a bit less, but the numbers don't change. So I hope I've summarized the research here and helped you be a bit clearer on how much protein exactly you need per day, depending on your body weight, in order to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis and lay down new muscle tissue on your frame. For more videos about biology, the medicine of fitness, physiological pathways, and how to optimize your training, please consider subscribing, where I tell you how to use this knowledge in order to reach your goals more effectively. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.